In this episode, my friend Dr. Paul Cleveland and I have a discussion about his fourth book, The Great Utopian Delusion. Although this book was printed in 2015, it is unbelievably relevant today in 2022. I had fun and hope you enjoyed listening. Thank you. Hey, welcome to the Banking with Life podcast. I'm your host, James Neathery, and I have my friend on, Dr. Paul Cleveland. He's a perennial guest. You know, he comes on basically every time I ask you. Thank you for that, Paul.
Oh, absolutely. Glad to.
Dr. Paul Cleveland, you know, he's a friend of Nelson, a client of Nelson Nash's. He's a PhD economist out of Birmingham Southern. And I really don't know all of your credentials. I just know you have a lot of them, and they're well earned. If you could expand on all the things that you participate in, Paul.
Well, sure. So, I'm a professor of finance and economics at Birmingham Southern. And I became an educational entrepreneur back in 2003 and ended up publishing my first book, Understanding the Modern Culture Wars. And Clarence Carson was one of my mentors, and he was actually the one who got me to do that.
I did not know that.
Yeah, he was working on basically history and social science for high schoolers. And he had written 6-volume American history set. He had written an economics text. And his last book was American Government. And so he was calling them all basic American history, basic economics, basic American government. And really, I think what he wanted to do is basic Western civilization. But he was getting it along in years, and he didn't want to do the work. So he,
I can relate to that.
Let's find this young, scrapping young man in academia and get him to do it. So, but he was very gracious with his time to read what I was writing and to make recommendations. And so, that's kind of how I got started. Now, the way I ended up self-publishing was that I had finished the manuscript, and I thought the organization that he had created, we would publish it through there. And he came to me, he said, Paul, I really think you need to find another publisher. Well, that wasn't necessarily good news at the time. And he did it for two reasons. He had lost his largest retailer of books, and his health was also declining, and he knew that. Yeah. And so he knew that I really needed to look to do something else. Anyway, long story short, he had self-published. So here I had, my mentor had done this, and a counselor of mine just suggested, well, Paul, why don't you do it? And so we did, and launched Boundary Stone. Our website now is boundarystone.org, and we published that first book. And, I think God was gracious. We broke even on the book within about 6 months.
Wow.
So I thought, oh, this stuff is easy. It really hasn't been that easy. But, and I won't go into the story, but the long and short of it is that over time, more and more of Dr. Carson's books have come to me. As a matter of fact, I now own the publishing and copyrights to all of what he had done. So, and we're keeping it alive, and we're trying to repackage it for high schoolers. Our target market's primarily, I think, homeschoolers. But beyond homeschoolers, I think these are excellent books for almost any school that really wants to study history as it was instead of the remake history that's so often out there in government school education.
I agree. Now, that first book y'all did was Understanding the Modern Culture Wars or Basic Economics?
It was Understanding the Modern Culture Wars.
Okay. And then, because I know of 4 books you've written, there may be more.
Right. The second book I did for a popular audience, and it actually sprung out of a class I was teaching at the time on public choice. And I titled it Unmasking the Sacred Lies. And in actuality, what it is, it's an economic history of public policy in America. So I just go through policy area after policy area, and where did government get involved, and then how they screw it up, and what did they do after they screwed it up, but they screwed it up more.
A fabulous book. I think that was the first book of yours that I was introduced to.
Right. And then after that one, that's where I got involved with beginning to update Clarence's work. I took the basic economics, which is, really my field, and it really needed to be updated. I liked it a lot, but it really needed some work. And so I took that and I got the copyright to it, and we republished it in a 3rd edition. And my son came to me and he said, well, Dad, it's a nice book and all, but if we're going to target actual homeschoolers, we need to make it better for them, to make it more user-friendly in that area. So we ended up, between the two of us, working on that one and redoing it and building an online course to go with it. And we also have an online course with government as well. And right now we're working on American history. So
perfect. When is the American history going to be done?
Well, we're taking that 6-volume set, and we're going to have 2 books, and it'll be American History 1, and that will be aimed at 9th grade. And so roughly it goes from, the exploration of America all the way up to about the late 1800s. So, bits and pieces of 1890 and that sort of thing in there. And then the next volume, American History 2, will go from that point in time to the present. And that'd be 10th grade. At that point, what we'll do is we'll probably redo the Western civilization text. I titled it Understanding the Modern Culture Wars, but we'll probably redo that book and retitle it with the basic theme, Basic Western Civilization, and keep those titles.
That would be a great overlay and a continuation, it sounds to me like.
Right. So that's kind of where we are in terms of development. And, this is a family venture for me, so we're doing the best we can as we push forward and get that done.
Yeah, I love that. It's a great opportunity most people don't get to have or enjoy, family ventures. And that kind of takes us up to the book that I kind of would like for you to talk about today.
Okay.
All right, The Great Utopian Delusion.
Right. So The Great Utopian Delusion, the origination of that book was actually from Nelson Nash. Nelson was having some back trouble, and so he was laying on the couch in his office. And he saw a book that Dr. Carson had written back in the 1970s titled The World in the Grip of an Idea. And so he called Mary in, and he pointed to the book. He says, Mary, get that book down for me. I want to reread it. So she got it down, and he reread it. And he came to me, he said, Paul, we've got to republish this book. Well, the problem was that book is a great book, but it was nearly 500 pages, and it was academic. There's no market for that book. Nobody's going to buy and read that book. And so I thought about it, and I said, what if we use that as a core, we borrowed from it, and we did something that's much more readable, and then also that can reach a popular audience and get all the best ideas out of it. He thought that was a great idea. So I enlisted a friend of mine that we went to grad school together, Dwayne Barney, and we began to work on that project. And there were twists and turns, but I had to actually go out and retrieve the copyright to that book from a publisher in New York. They had the publication rights and the copyright. Now, Clarence had the copyright. They had the publication right. But we had to petition them to get that signed back over to us. And part of that was give them 30 days to republish or relinquish the publication. Oh. Fortunately, that was in Clarence's contract, and so we were able to get it done. And we came out with it, and that was 2015. But that book accurately describes exactly what the political situation is today.
Exactly.
It's right on target. And Clarence saw this. I mean, he saw this years ago, back in the 70s. He understood this, and he taught it to me. I had read that book. I thought it was a great book. It was interesting, too, because when the Soviet Union collapsed, everybody was jumping up and down, okay, socialism is over. And Clarence just sat back and said, y'all aren't paying attention. It's not over. It's very much still alive, and we're in the thick of it. Of course, in the Western world, we're in the thick of it in terms of evolutionary socialism. That is socialism given to you piecemeal, one bite at a time. And I think most people don't realize both political parties, by far and away, are socialist parties. The only difference between the Democrats and the Republicans is, do you want your socialism packed in heavy syrup, which is the Democrats, or do you want it packed in light syrup, which is the Republicans? Or another way to put it, you want Budweiser or Bud Light?
It's either creeping socialism or galloping socialism.
Just galloping socialism. And right now we've got runaway.
Yeah, runaway.
Runaway socialism. And the lie is, it's just astounding how these people are willing to lie and deceive and cheat and steal, all the other.
I remember reading the book. I think Nelson even shared an excerpt of the draft with me, but he told me not to tell you at the time. But he didn't share the whole draft with me, just a little section, because he was so excited about it, right? And I'm like, man, I can't wait to read it. And so when it was published, I read it, and now that's been 7 years roughly. And so when you, agreed to come back on and to talk about this, I thought, well, James, you ought to refresh yourself, and pick that book up again. And so I did, and I haven't completed it again for the second reading, but oh my gosh, it's as if it is so relevant. I mean, there's no question. Clarence wrote about it 50 years ago, right? And seen it 50 years ago, and I've seen his original work too. I haven't read that. I've seen the big voluminous work. Yeah, and this is a easily digestible, very easily read, and unbelievably accurate, in my opinion, of what's going on today. And I think it, maybe if I can use your words, the incremental or the piecemeal. Yeah. It's almost like we're in a daze or we're asleep and we're just accepting it, but not connecting the dots, not putting the big picture together of what's really going on.
I think that's exactly right. And most people don't, because, they've been lured to sleep and they've been willing to accept it without really thinking it through as to what they're accepting. One of the stories that use oftentimes with people on this, that what you're doing it by going down this socialist path, what you're doing is you're giving up your freedom. And one of the stories that I tell is about a congressman, Stephen Pace. And this congressman, this was in the 1920s, and he'd been asked to come back to his district and explain to the people why he would not vote for a farm subsidy bill. Now, his district was a rural district in Georgia. And so most of his constituents were farmers who potentially would be benefited from this particular piece of legislation. At any rate, so they had a barbecue on the banks of the Mulgy River, and he came to explain why he would not vote for this bill. When he got there, he said he got up to speak to the subject, and instead of speaking directly to it, he said, ladies and gentlemen, he pointed at the river. He said, just a few miles down this river, there's a bend in the river. And at one time, there were a pack of wild hogs that lived out in that bend, in that thicket. And they lived through every kind of natural disaster you can imagine, through fires, freezes, floods, droughts, you name it, they survived. As a matter of fact, they were so wiry that for a hunter to be able to get off a clean shot and actually kill one, that would make the local news. Well, one day a man rode into the local town, and he was in his wagon. He got slowly out of his wagon, went into the general store, and he went up to the store owner, and he was asking the whereabouts of that thicket and those hogs. So the store owner gave the man directions, and he walked slowly out of the store, got back on his wagon, rode out of town. Well, the store owner really didn't think much about that until about 5 or 6 months later, the same man came back into the store owner. And he said, sir, I was wondering if maybe you know some people, some men who would like to make a little extra money. I've got all these hogs in a pen out by the river, and I need help bringing them into market. Well, the store owner was amazed. He said, there's no way you captured all those hogs. He said, well, you're willing to come out and see. I mean, you're free to do that. Well, the news traveled through the town. Everybody had to go out and see this thing. So they all went out to where the thicket was and those hogs. And sure enough, this guy had a big pen built. He had all those hogs in it. And the people were just astounded. They were amazed. How in the world? This is impossible. Nobody could catch all these hogs. He said, actually, it was pretty easy. When I first got out here, I just threw out a couple of ears of corn. Those hogs wouldn't go near the corn for the first 3 weeks. But finally, a couple of the young ones ran out of the brush, picked up a couple of ears, and then beat back off into the thicket. So I just kept putting out corn every day. And then pretty soon I thought they were all eating it. So that's when I started to build the pen. I built it a little higher, a little further around every day. And when I finally noticed they quit foraging for roots and berries and such, I put a trap door on that pen so they could all get into that corn but couldn't get back out. I said, I can trap any animal on the face of this earth. It'll just depend on me for a free handout. And, it's a great story. It gets right to the point. Yeah. Dependency on Washington, D.C. is giving up your freedom because whatever the government giveth, the government can taketh away. Yeah. And the government can't give you anything that it hasn't taken from someplace. And so all of socialism is nothing but a political system of theft. And it's rooted in theft because it's rooted in Marxism, and Marx had a criminal mind. He wanted to steal everything. And so, that's what he imagined, and that we're gonna steal everything. And so really that's what they're about doing.
They've perfected it. I mean, all they do. I'm from Texas, and I would like them to think about meeting every 2 years instead of every year.
Yeah.
Because there's really only two things that they do when they get together and when they meet. They take away your property and your rights. That's all they do.
Yeah, that's about it. And they create fear. I mean, they're doing it again. Yeah. I don't know when they're going to get over this COVID thing. I mean, at this point, okay, it looks like COVID is here to stay. So, it's time to live with it, just like you live with the flu. I mean, that's where we're at.
Well, if they need a new variant, they'll just create it, right?
Well, I think the thing, once out of the bag, it is varying, but it's varying ways. It might be more contagious, but it's less deadly. I think saw the numbers. The latest numbers are across the spectrum. The new variant death rate is under 1%. That's even for old people. And remember, that's what we were so worried about earlier, because the death rate among the elderly with the original had been around 5%. And then for younger people, it was inconsequential. That created a lot of fear early on. But now, I mean, the death rate with COVID is actually lower than that with the flu.
Well, they've used it to gin up fear, no question about that. Oh. I mean, it's like a tool. That's a tool they depend upon, is fear, generating fear.
That was one of Nelson's favorite terms for Washington, D.C., the fear factory.
Yeah, the fear factory. Well, how do you know how the constituents in Mr. Pace's neck of the woods down there, how they received that?
I think they got the message. I mean, the message is not hard to miss when in a story like that.
Right.
Now, whether they like the message or not, I mean, because we're all out there. I mean, people. It's so easy to try to get something for nothing, and to try to justify that. So I think there are always people willing to do that. But if you're moral, morality would say, no, that's not really the way we ought to go. So
you talk a little bit about, morality in this book, The Great Utopian Delusion. The governments at some level must exist, but they're filled with people.
Right.
They have potentially moral issues.
Sure.
Then if they're immoral, I mean, you're going to have an immoral government.
Right.
And
that's one of the reasons you would want to limit the power of government, and make it very specific, because there is a role for government for us to live in relative peace and order. Then hardcore wrongdoers need to be punished. One thing our governments seem to want to get rid of is actually punishing murderers, rapists, and thieves. But that's what government ought to be doing.
They import them now. Right?
I know. This is the craziest thing in the world. That's what you need government to do. You don't need it to provide. The governments can't provide for anything. They can't provide for you. They're institutions that are absolutely dependent upon the citizenry for their existence. Yep. And the question to be asked is, in a way, government is the collective use of force against wrongdoers, right? And so the question then is, when is it legitimate for an individual to use violence or force? Well, if somebody's attacking you, right? If somebody's trying to mug you on the streets, then it's legitimate for you to use force to stop them. You know, this gentleman up in New York who's operating a bodega, and a thug comes in and is harassing him, shaking him, and his girlfriend stabs him, and he picks up a knife and gets the boyfriend, who dies, and the DA there is charging the owner of the bodega with murder. That's insanity. That is insanity. Self-defense is legitimate. And so governments should be, tracking down the woman who knifed the owner. Yeah. It was self-defense in terms of this man dying. I mean, he was the aggressor. Right. And for somebody to defend themselves, that's perfectly just. So governments should actually be working, as the collective action of the people to protect their life, their liberty, and their property, period. That's it. And when we get beyond that, then we start moving towards really ugly government, because government's not well suited to do other things. They are well suited to blow stuff up, to destroy stuff and all that, but they're not well suited to, have schools and, everything else under the sun.
Yeah. It's profitable for them to blow things up so they can make more profits rebuilding them. All right.
Yeah.
There has to be an end somewhere.
Unfortunately, this is usually how nations collapse. I mean, if you know history, this is the way the Roman Empire collapsed. And really one of the big issues with the collapsing Roman Empire was owed to its inflation, monetary inflation. And we have a lot of that going on right now. I was just looking at the numbers the other day. Are you interested in some of these numbers?
Maybe. Bring them on.
All right. I think you've known this. Bob Murphy has done this at a number of the think tanks. And
sure.
So back in 2008, when we had the real estate crisis, the monetary base, which is referred to as high-powered money, that is the dollar value of the assets held by the Federal Reserve. Okay, so the federal, in essence, and it doesn't work exactly like this, but essentially the same. The Federal Reserve has the power to create up money out of thin air and buy up securities. And for the longest time, what the Federal Reserve was buying up were largely U.S. treasuries. All right, so their total asset holdings in August of 2008 was $847.6 billion. Then we had the real estate crisis, and so by April of 2009, their asset holdings had jumped from that to $1.75 trillion. Double,
yeah.
And this is considered high-powered money, right? So
government securities, right?
Yeah, I mean, if it gets out in the commercial banking system, lend out, it could be a factor of 10, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And then we went through all the quantitative easing. By October of 2014, the monetary base was at $4 trillion. In March of 2020, I had gone down a little to 3.9 trillion. But all right, so that was the beginning of the pandemic.
All right.
By December 2021, the monetary base had increased to $6.4 trillion.
Yeah.
April 2022, so just recently, it stood at $5.9 trillion. Now, one would have thought, okay, we would have saw price increases that were exorbitant. And of course we didn't. And I think Bob, you probably are familiar with this one, did a great job of explaining why, because excess reserves went way up because the Federal Reserve back in 2008 started paying banks interest on their excess reserves.
Don't lend it out.
And so their excess reserves in July of 2008 stood at $1.9 billion. And around that, if you look historically, around that $2 billion in all of the commercial system, that was pretty standard. That was virtually zero excess reserves in the system. By December 2008, those excess reserves had gone up to $767 billion from $2 billion.
Wow.
By August 2014, it was at $2.7 trillion. Now, in January of 2020, it had dropped some. It was at $1.5 trillion, but still well on up there. But by June of 2020, it was back up to $3 trillion. And then if you look at the interest rates that the Fed was paying, started out at 0.5%. But this is a great deal for banks. So
sure,
that they have money in excess reserves that was literally just given to them by the Fed. And the Fed says, oh, we're going to pay you interest on this, not to loan it out. What a great deal. Well, they kept having to step it up. So they stepped it up to 0.75%, to 1%, to 1.5%. At its height, the Fed was paying 2.4% interest in 2019. Now, since then, they've given up that game. And it's dropped back down. Now they're only paying 0.15% on excess reserves to banks. And so banks have started lending stuff out again. Just some numbers on monetary measurements. So M1 is one of the measures of the money supply, and then M2 is a little bit broader. It includes more stuff. So M1 in February 2020 stood at $4 trillion. By July 2020, it was $16.8 trillion. In April of 2022, it was $20.6 trillion. M2, which is a broader measure, in other words, includes more stuff. The increase is not, because it includes so much other sorts of things, it's not quite as great a growth as the M1, but in January of 20, it stood at $15.5 trillion. And in June of 2022, it's now at $21.7 trillion, which is a 40% increase in the money supply. So with that kind of increase in the money supply, you can imagine what money prices, what's happening to money prices. And the current administration is only piled on by restricting production of various sorts. And, making it more difficult to produce crude oil and the like. Those sorts of things have just really exacerbated the situation, if you will. New regulations, increasing costs, all those sorts of things. That's kind of where we're at.
So we still have faith in the U.S. dollar, though. Thank goodness, right?
Well, I don't see. I mean, what other? I don't think we're going to do business in other currencies necessarily. The cryptocurrencies, I don't consider those real money right now because, for something to be acceptable as money, it's got to be readily accepted. It's got to have stable value. Cryptocurrencies have neither one. So, and a lot of people I don't think really understand them at all. So I don't think they're a sound alternative. I really can't see us trying to use gold and silver coins at this juncture. We could get to that, I suppose, at some point, but we will have, this hole that we've dug is deep, but our overall economy is pretty darn big. And I think people need to understand that the economy is still pretty large and all is not lost. My whole thing in suggesting to people is invest in what you know. And by doing that, then, whatever you're an expert in, try to be entrepreneurial, build a business out of it. People, no matter where we are, we're all going to need things, right? Yeah. We're all going to need things. And the only way to be successful at that is to trade, right? Because I'm not good at everything. We're zooming over here. I've got my Apple MacBook Air here, and we're zooming online. I have no clue how this stuff works.
Well, I've got an AV Ninja. That's why I'm here.
Yeah,
I don't know how it works either.
So, we need people. We need people to do things that we don't have a clue about. And so what do I really know about? Well, I know a heck of a lot about history and economics and finance. Yeah. And so that's what, if I can build a business that provides educational opportunities for people to understand things in an easy way, because people need to understand these things if you're going to protect yourself, right? You can't protect yourself if you're taken in by the schmucks up in Washington. They don't want you to understand it.
Is that a technical term, sir? Schmuck. I agree. I think people should invest in themselves and what they know.
Right.
That's the best investment. And then, at the end of the day, you should be financing everything that you're going to purchase anyway. And that's why I promote, the infinite banking concept, Nelson's work. Because it's not going to change. I mean, the federal government doesn't even have the ability to restrain itself. Right. It's not going to wake up one day and say, "Oh, we've got too many employees."
Right.
No way. And
but you think about that. I mentioned I started the business in 2003.
Yes. Yes.
If I had not started IBC, I don't think that would have happened.
Is that right?
Well, where did I get the funding for?
Right. And you controlled the whole cash flow. You controlled the whole banking function.
So, I said I broke even. So took out a loan, printed books up, sold books, paid off loan.
I love that.
Yeah.
And the people, the listener will have the opportunity to purchase your books in the notes, below.
Okay.
I think we carry a couple of your books, several of your books, maybe all of your books, but we'll put your store in there as well.
Okay.
And at the end of the day, we have a great empire here, and they have the military industrial, security complex to ensure that the, world reserve currency is still accepted at some level. And,
right. And you know, at the there's a big struggle going on worldwide, and of course, the Chinese would love to take over the U.S. position as the currency of exchange. I don't think they can actually make that happen. You know, the problem that they have is they've been playing this mercantilist game of maintaining exports and trying to peg their currency exchange rates in order to keep those export markets going. That's a loser's game. You know, that one doesn't work. As a matter of fact, I was in China in 2008. It actually is October 2008. So, real estate crisis was going big. And so I was in China. I was lecturing at different universities, really basic economics lectures. Okay. So one evening I was at their technical university in the city that I was in, and I was giving this lecture. And it was in the auditorium was filled. There must have been at least 300 Chinese students filling the auditorium, and they all wanted to practice their English. They're all in an English club, and so I gave my lecture, and there was a young man raised his hand right off for the Q&A, and so I pointed to him, and he goes, "Professor Cleveland, your country have financial crisis." I said, yes, we do. He says, "Professor Cleveland, you know, Bank of China owns lots of U.S. debt." I said, "Yeah, I know that. I know that." And then he asked another question. He asked me, "Do you understand what would happen in your crisis should Bank of China sell debt?" And I said, "Well, it would get a lot worse, wouldn't it?" And then he got to his real question. "Well, can you think of any reason why Bank of China should not sell?" And I looked at him and I said, "Quite frankly, I can't think of any good reason why the Bank of China bought it in the first place." I mean, you understand what I'm saying? You guys are on the hook too. You got to find a buyer for that crap. Yep. And you should have always, along the way, allowed for the U.S. dollar to depreciate against your currency. Now, it would have made the stuff you're making more expensive for us. That's true. And we wouldn't have bought as much of it. But you have 1 billion people. And, you know, they're working and producing stuff. Why don't y'all buy it? Right? But they're very short-sighted, and they can't see it. And they're becoming even more short-sighted under this current Xi. I mean, this guy's, you know, he's a total communist lunatic. And so he's killing really what they've had. And you know, by putting the kibosh on everything. So I'm not at all sure that China's in a position that they're going to be able to do anything much with that. All right. Now, the threat is there because of their military. Yeah. I mean, there's a huge threat, but militarily, but economically, I'm not sure I see it.
I think I read a headline either last night, this morning, sometime, that a pretty large bank in China closed and created a run on that particular bank.
Right. Well, they've built a lot of stuff that is, this is sort of the Asian mentality too. The Japanese have done this. I think the Koreans to an extent have done some of this, where they sort of have this engineering mindset. Yep. If we can figure out how to do it, then we should. You know, it's like a bullet train or a lot of this other sort of stuff. or build an airport at sea that's sinking.
Cities that have no occupants.
Right, exactly. And, that's not economic.
No.
I mean, just because you can build it doesn't mean it's a good idea to build it. And so they don't think like economists. And that is a huge flaw. If they ever get the economics right, the people themselves are tremendously entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
So if they ever figure out economics, China can be really a thriving economy, but only when they really become a true free market, and they're retrenching away from that. Yeah. They had moved from being communistic to being mercantilistic, which that helped them out tremendously. And they had those free market zones, and
they went from heavy syrup to light syrup, huh?
But now they're heading back to heavy syrup.
Yep.
Full blown heavy syrup, and so that's. I wonder if in the United States that the socialists have gone way too far, and that the blowback is going to be incredible this time around, because I don't think people put up with it. And unlike China, we have guns.
Record sales of guns and ammo.
Record sales.
Yeah.
That's the thing in the U.S. that is so different, and I don't think we're giving up guns anytime soon.
Record sales.
I know.
I mean,
and I'm wondering how much the military would actually go with them in the U.S. I don't know.
I don't either. I'm afraid more than
we can. No,
more than we'd want to. Yeah. I mean, how does the military go along with every empire throughout history that has traveled all over the known world, destroying people and civilizations?
Well, that's true. It's taught,
right? Paid for with big money, good money, right?
Right. So I mean, it's this whole thing about patriotism. Right.
Yeah.
Is inculcated.
I didn't know, and I learned this from Nelson Nash. Before World War II, when, the people, the school children pledged allegiance to the flag, do you know they had their arm out forward, saluting the flag? Yeah. And they got away from that, quit doing that because it resembled the Nazi salute.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, there's so many things about the New Deal in that time period that resembled Nazi Germany.
Oh, yeah.
30s.
Yeah.
So it's just embedded, just that socialism. Well, of course, we can't call it that in the U.S. People say, "Oh, we don't have socialism." No, well, yeah, we do. We have socialist schools and all kinds of socialists.
I tell this story often because it's mine and it was very, impressed upon me. So when I was going into high school, you had to go up in the summertime to pick your classes. Mm-hmm. And, the hard worker that I am, I was always working. So I was one of the last guys to show up and pick the classes.
Right.
And, you're supposed to start out with American history in 9th grade, high school. Well, those classes were filled up. Not that I had a choice to do that or not, but those classes were full. So I had to take government first. Okay. And so the next year I was able to go back and take American history. And had a nice, lovely lady teacher. And I had this book for the longest time. I mean, this was some years ago now, but the high school American history curriculum, the textbook. And it's different chapters covered different topics.
Right.
And one of the chapters covered FDR's New Deal. And then a couple of chapters before or a couple of chapters after, it was talking about the communist socialism, but the Communist Manifesto was covered in that chapter. Right. So I'm flipping back and forth between the two chapters, and there's not much difference in the programs at all.
Right. And that's true.
I pointed that out to my history teacher, whom FDR was obviously her idol. Yeah. And she threw me out of the class. She did. Because I just said they're the same thing, you know. And it made her angry.
Well, if you go through that 10-point plan that Marx laid out, right? I mean, he wasn't in favor of gradualism or evolutionary socialism, but he did put a 10-point plan together. And almost all of those 10 points, they've been pushing for quite some time. So to say that FDR and the Democrats are not socialists is ridiculous.
Yeah. I like to, I think it was at least the second great wave of socialism through the U.S. Obama's.
Well, we've been through a few. Yeah. It began with Woodrow Wilson. Now, we didn't have, at that time, if he hadn't had a stroke, it would have been possible for Wilson to run again as president. But that was, in 1920. But, the stroke of good luck.
Yeah, it's like Aaron Burr, that was a good stroke of luck. It was just a little late, right? He couldn't do it. So, the deal was that we had a reprieve with Cooling and, Harding at that time period. But then we had Hoover. Hoover was terrible. Yep. I was talking about Hoover at a pool party the other day. A friend of mine, I love him dearly. He was going on and on about how great Hoover was, and he was talking about Ukraine and the bread basket of the world and kind of modern, what's going on over there, and the devastation of Ukraine. And this is the third or fourth time that that's happened. Hoover. There's a backstory to Hoover before he became president and all the shenanigans that he did and all the money that he made, pilfering, the Ukrainian wheat. And then I have another friend who has a German heritage, and he was telling me how the Germans loved him because he fed them, the wheat. Right. Well, and there's only parts of history that these individuals and even myself are referring to. But when you put it all in totality, none of them are good guys. None of them. None of them.
In fact, Hoover paved the way for Roosevelt because he was so bad. He set off. He and Congress set off the international trade war with the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Yep. And that collapsing worldwide trade that followed that was that opened the door for Adolf Hitler to rise to power in Germany with his nationalism. What? The Nazi Party, Nazi stood for the National Socialist Party. They were nationalist socialists. And the only thing different between his socialism and Russia's socialism is that it had a national focus rather than a worldwide focus. Yeah. But same, brothers under the skin. So people just get that wrong. They think that somehow the war, between Russia and Germany was their opposite sides of the political spectrum. Well, no, that's not. That's an incorrect view. That's not at all together true. Most political leaders in the 20th century, to some degree, they were all embracing a military welfare complex and piecemeal movement towards socialist society. And their tool to get there, of course, the education system, got to control it because you got to control the message. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, Marxists adopted environmentalism as their new method of consolidating power and control. And so that's why, I refer to modern day environmentalists as watermelons. They're green on the outside, but you cut them open and they're actually just the same old red commies. And, they're now the environmentalists, the deep ecologists, their agenda is different. They want to destroy humanity because they think human beings are a plague on the planet. Yep. And they say as much. And to a certain extent, this mixture of deep ecologists and of the leftists over time has kind of merged a little bit because most of these intellectuals have bought into the notion of Paul Ehrlich's population bomb that we have too many people. Yeah. And I saw a meme on social media. It says that you are the carbon that they want to reduce, which is, pretty, I think there's something to be said about that.
I haven't seen that meme. I've been saying that for over a year.
Oh, yeah.
No,
I think that's part of they've adopted that one as part of their agenda. And it's almost like they run in these little circles and they never get out of their circle anymore to actually talk with anyone. And all they can see is the places where they want to go vacation. There are more people there. Why are there more people there? Because more people can afford to be there. Yeah. And so they have to pay more to get away from the more people. And so that's their notion. But if you look at it, the numbers just aren't there. For example, population density. Well, Ehrlich did his book based upon his time in New Delhi. And I don't know if you've read the book, but the opening of the book is people everywhere. It's hot, it's dirty, we're riding in a cab, there's just people. Well, yeah, in New Delhi, there are a lot of people and they're poor. All right. But the population density of India is actually lower than the population density of the Netherlands. Why? Well, the Netherlands is relatively rich. By comparison, people, you live better. So it's not population density at all. I remember reading P.J. O'Rourke's book, Eat the Rich, and he's talking why are some countries rich and other countries poor. And he's traveling in Russia. And he took a train all the way east through Siberia. And as he's on the train, he's taking notes, he's writing, they could use a little urban sprawl out here because there's nothing there. There's nothing. Mile after mile after mile of nothing. and except trees, and and that's it. I mean, and it's that way up in Canada too, right? I mean, there are lots of places in Canada there's just nothing up there. So actually, if we warm the globe a little, I mean, people might move there. Now, in fact, we might move there out of Texas and Alabama to, or maybe just go back to better refrigerants for ACs. Stay inside in the summer, and
listen, it's 105 down here. Talking about
I know.
refrigerants.
So you stay inside and you run your AC, okay.
Or the swimming pool. It's one of
or the swim. Well, yeah. There's we have options,
right?
And but it's always been hot in Alabama and Texas in the summer. Heck, when I was doing my PhD work at Texas A&M, that's one of the hottest places on the planet.
Yeah. When was that? When were you?
So I was there from 1980 to 85.
Yeah. See, 80. We set up all the records in 1980 that we can't really break them. We can tie some of them. Yeah. The heat.
Well, it was hot. I mean, it was like our typical day in the summer was 95 to 100 degrees with 95% humidity. So you take a shower, you walk outside, you can't even tell. You might as well still back in the shower.
Well, 1980 was hot. There was some record setting, and then just walking outside, walking outside. That's daily life in Houston, Texas.
Oh yeah, right. Absolutely. I mean, and then College Station,
yep.
Basically the same weather.
Yeah.
I remember the wife of one of my peers in the program. She was getting her car, and she happened to put her knee down on the console where they had some money, some coins. So she got a tattoo.
Got branded.
Branded.
It's hot. Yeah, it's hot. Well, listen, Paul, we've been going for about an hour. And I could talk all day. I appreciate you and the way you think and the way you write and what you write, So, anything in closing do you want to cover or mention?
I think, we were talking about just the fact that I think that people really need to have an entrepreneurial mindset. If we're going to take back the country, we have to embrace, I think really important to embrace individual responsibility. That I'm responsible for my life and how I live it. And part of that then is, how am I going to interact with other people? Do I want to try to enslave them through political means to achieve my ends? Which that's not individual responsibility. Or do I want to accept responsibility for myself to produce something of value for my neighbor and engage in a voluntary trading relationship with those around me that's mutually beneficial? And so I think that is the starting point in my estimation. And I think part of that, and I'll go back to this, and I don't know what other people would think, but I think part of doing that is embracing the gospel message. Because until I recognize my own shortcomings and my own wishes to live off others at times, which I've been guilty of doing. I did it against my parents for years, and failed to grow up. And so part of this is growing up, and part of growing up is going, I have been far less than I should ever be before my Creator. And therefore, let me accept by faith his solution, because I don't have a solution that would overcome my shortcomings before him. And if he judges me justly, I would be in trouble. Yep. And I think that's the first step in really taking responsibility for one's actions, because it's just about fessing up.
Yeah. I like that. I like that a lot. And then there's got to be some level of care that I must have toward my neighbor.
Right.
To,
well, I think that's the beauty of the gospel, because it's a message of God coming into the world, the incarnate Son of God, coming into the world, living the perfect submissive life, which is God's standard, and then willingly sacrificing himself as an atoning sacrifice for sin. And then that if you put your trust in that instead of yourself, then he'll forgive you. That's grace. That's true grace. That's true mercy. That's voluntary sacrifice motivated by love. So if I do that first, then I think I will be charitable towards my neighbor. I'll go beyond just trading with them, but to be charitable towards them as well. And that's where good communities are. Government's never charitable. It doesn't have anything to be charitable with. And so it can never produce the good society. It doesn't have the ability to do so. But that, the socialists of our day, they think they're going to get to utopia via government and the law. And it's not going to happen. They're going to end up with hell on earth. So I would say that's where I would like to wrap it up.
There's not much I can add to that, sir. So good job.
All right.
I appreciate that. Okay. As always, thank you, Paul. Look forward to seeing you again, which will more than likely be October. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that will work perfectly well for me. Thanks, James. Right.
Okay. Thank you. Have a great day. All right.
You too.
Thank you for joining us on the Banking with Life podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe and click on that little notification bell. Otherwise, join us on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher for weekly content.